Here we go. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Frontline Events. I'm Michael Bociurkiw, your moderator for today. I'm a global affairs analyst, a regular contributor to CNN Opinion and other pages of opinion, and also host of the podcast Global Impact, and of course, a proud member of the Frontline Club. I greet you from sunny Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada, where right now it's 11 a.m. on February 25th. I'd like to begin by introducing our distinguished panelists. Today we've an amazing mix of foreign correspondents and experts who between them have many books and awards, notable headlines, and other amazing achievements. Now, just a few housekeeping rules to our audience members. Thank you very, very much for joining this Frontline Club event. I see we've people joining us from right across the globe. And if you have questions, there are two ways. At the bottom of your screen, you can click on the comment box and simply type in your question. That will be monitored throughout. And you can also click on the raise your hand icon and we will try to go to you live to pose your question. Please also note that after the panel, we'll be posting the full recording online. And of course, the easiest way to get that link is to subscribe to the Frontline Club on the YouTube channel and switch on notifications. So first of all, I'm going to, as I said, introduce our distinguished panelists, and we'll start from closest to my time zone, Eastern time zone, where in New York City at the moment, we have Janine di Giovanni. She is a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and a lecturer on human rights and foreign policy. She's a conflict analyst, the award-winning author of 9 books, no less, with the latest being The Vanishing, and it's about Christian minorities in the Middle East. And that comes out in the autumn. Her previous books all focused on war and conflict. And as a journalist, she's reported from more than 18 countries on 4 continents and received more than a dozen well-deserved awards for her work. She is a lifetime member of the Distinguished Council on Foreign Relations. Michael Vaticiotis, he joined us earlier in a pre-record from Singapore. He is an armed conflict mediator and writer with 40 years experience in Asia Pacific. He is author of the book Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia. Many of us current and former Asia hands, of course, recognize Michael's name as being on the masthead of the venerable Far Eastern Economic Review, which closed down many, many years ago, but he did a fantastic job on that. And currently, he's based in Singapore as Regional Director Asia for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Michael Holmes, joining us today from Atlanta, is an award-winning anchor and correspondent for CNN International based at network headquarters. He has been in journalism for more than 4 decades. Now, Michael first joined CNN International in 1996 as the first Australian anchor for the network, and I got to say, he's still very distinguishable by his refined Aussie accent. Michael has reported extensively from all corners of the globe, including Asia, Europe, the Middle East, Mexico, India, Ukraine, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, traveled to more than 80 countries. And I know from the many times that the two of us have been on air together, he brings all that experience to bear in his interview style. He's covered numerous conflicts around the globe, Iraq, Afghanistan, West Bank, and Gaza. And he reported on the war in Iraq from the very beginning, making more than a dozen trips there. And in January 2004, he survived an ambush on a 2-vehicle CNN convoy, which left 2 CNN staff dead and one wounded. And in earlier years, he worked for Australia's 9 network, also covering a number of foreign events. Finally, he's a former newspaper man. He waited a long time to enter journalism. He began his career at the age of 17 as a cub reporter for an Australian newspaper. Ayla Jean Yackley. Hello, Ayla in Istanbul. Ayla is a journalist who has been based in Turkey for more than 2 decades, covering politics and the economy. She currently writes for the Financial Times newspaper, a newspaper we all love. And her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, and others. Previously, she was a correspondent for Reuters and Bloomberg News, and her reporting has taken her to Iraq, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, Russia, Germany, and Cyprus. And I remember meeting Ayla for the first time on the Turkey-Iraq border when I was with UNICEF at the time. Lina Sinjab joining us today from Beirut. Welcome, Lina. Lina is BBC Middle East correspondent based in Beirut and an independent filmmaker. In 2014, she covered the Syria peace talks in Geneva as BBC World Affairs reporter. And before that, from 2007, she was the BBC's Damascus correspondent. She has covered the uprising in her native Syria since its beginnings in 2011 and continues to follow developments in the region. She has also covered the popular uprisings in Yemen and Libya. Excuse me. Lina produced a documentary, Damascus Diary, which is a collection of personal observations in Syria, and also directed Madness in Aleppo, focusing on the work and travails of 2 medical workers. Last but certainly not least, Andrei Soldatov is an investigative journalist and editor of Agentura.ru, an information hub on intelligence agencies. He's also author of The Compatriots, the brutal and chaotic history of Russia's exiles, emigres, and agents abroad, and co-author of The Red Web, the struggle between Russia's digital dictators and the new online revolutionaries. Andrei has covered terrorist attacks and hostilities in the country and abroad, including the siege of the Nord-Ost in Moscow, the hostage crisis in Beslan, the war in Lebanon, and tensions in the Gaza Strip. He's usually based in Moscow. So before I get to our first question to one of our panelists, let me put a bit of framing into this panel for you. I will be asking our distinguished panelists really to take a look back and put on their future gazing glasses and look ahead. And I know it's a fairly big ask, but we hope that they can try and provide us a framework for us for the year ahead, taking into account the transition from the tumultuous Trump years, to put it mildly, including the ending, which saw an insurrection on Capitol Hill by rioters who said they claimed they were acting at the urging of the then president to help overturn an election that he falsely and outrageously claimed was stolen. In the US and in many parts of the world, we watch with concern, if not with fear, at a rising tide of populism, the spread of disinformation and manipulation, election meddling, cyber attacks. And now we not only have a new occupant in the White House, but we find ourselves in the midst of an unprecedented global pandemic, which has now sickened a staggering 112 million people worldwide and killed almost 2.5 million, and half of those in the United States alone. And of course, our thoughts and prayers are with the families and friends of the victims. And if that were not enough, experts tell us we've less than 3,000 days before irreversible climate change takes place. One superpower, China, will be this year commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. And how does the world handle a more aggressive and interventionist China? And only yesterday, Joe Biden's nominee for CIA director warned against China's predatory leadership, and that its economic power and tech prowess make it the biggest geopolitical test that we face. And then another superpower, Russia, will hold crucial local elections for deputies for the lower house of parliament, the Duma, while its most important opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, once again finds himself behind bars just months after an attempt on his life by Russian security services using no less than a military-grade nerve agent. And of course, we all remember the huge protests on successive weekends in the past weeks. Finally, the multilateral-based system appears in tatters. We woke up on New Year's Day, perhaps some of us not that clear-headed, with the UK no longer part of the EU. We also find institutions which secure our global commons mostly impotent. And in many places of conflict, the diplomatic toolbox appears depressingly empty, unable to bring about any durable solution. Finally, we hope to reflect on the journalism profession that has sadly become one of the most dangerous in the world, with last year alone, the CPJ reporting 33 reporters killed, 274 imprisoned in 2020. This year, already 64 are missing. One last quick point here. On Tuesday, US President Joe Biden held his first bilateral with the world leader, and is traditionally done, It was with America's closest neighbor, Canada. A major takeaway for me and for many others was a sense of restoration of civility in US foreign policy. Rather than being told there's a place in hell for our prime minister, we heard praise for Canada that the US has no better friend. What a difference an election makes. Let's break out the Tim Horton donuts. On that optimistic note, we will begin with Janine di Giovanni, and I know she's down with a bit of a cold, but let's go at it. Janine, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. And it's a real honor to be on a panel with such an eminent group of experts. So I'm very happy to be here. I apologize in advance for my voice. I'll go as long as I can, but I know I sound like a croaky bullfrog. So very interesting you bring up multilateralism. I was born in America, but I spent my entire adult life in Europe, first in the UK, which was then Europe, and secondly, France. I moved to the US in 2017 to take a position at the Council on Foreign Relations and later Yale University. So I see the US through a prism, which is, I think, pretty unique. I'm American, but I'm not really American. I'm used to having lived in countries that had extremely well-padded social services. America, as we know, is falling to pieces. So I'd like to look at, first of all, in general, what the American population went through during the Trump years. I see this country, being a conflict analyst and having lived through so many civil wars myself, as a country that's deeply traumatized from the Trump years, from not just the tweets, not just the fear of what he was going to do, because no one never knew, but the complete breakdown of diplomacy and, as you put it, decency and multilateralism. So one rather wonderful thing Joe Biden did, and let's see if he could stick to it, is to take away the "Make America Great Again," which was Trump's mantra, as we know, to "America is back." Now, what does that mean? Essentially, to me, by his appointments, which are extremely telling and give us an indication of what he's going to be looking at in terms of US foreign policy. He chose Antony Blinken as Secretary of State instead of Pompeo. Antony Blinken grew up in France, speaks perfect French, is an internationalist, and is also someone who's widely regarded, having worked in the State Department since the Obama years and before, as someone that people can work with in teams, in alliances. He's brought John Kerry back to make a priority out of climate change. Climate change is going to be one of the biggest issues that he'll be looking at. What you said, and Kerry said, we've got 9 years left, 9 years. So Kerry has set up an extraordinary office. They've revised the Paris Agreement, of course. The office in DC is being manned by one of my Yale colleagues, Sue Biniaz, who basically drafted the Paris Accords, a brilliant climate change lawyer. And they're going full throttle ahead, which is really, for me, amazing news. He's appointed Rob Malley to be head of he's the Iran envoy. Sorry, losing my voice a bit. He's going to be the Iran envoy. He is a longtime international crisis group chief. Before that, he was in Obama's National Security Council. He's an Iran watcher. Lina might have some different views on him because he does have very specific views on Hezbollah and on Iran. But in my view, the fact that Iran is going to be looked at again, and instead of being so demonized, in some way, we're going to revise the Iran talks. I see that as hugely strategic and important. Whereas the Trump mafia just demonized Iran, shifted it away, largely because of the Israeli lobby. As we know, Trump had a very close relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, his daughter Ivanka, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. We're very close to them. Jared grew up in an Orthodox home in Livingston, New Jersey. He has very close ties to the Saudis as well. Now we know as well that Biden is coming out and basically being very tough with the Saudis, which I think is great. He's actually called Saudi a pariah. Whereas Trump, as we know, in the murder of our colleague, Khashoggi, he basically drifted it, it went under the rug. Oh, he might have been murdered, he might not. Now Biden is really going to take a firm stand with Saudi. So Iran, climate, hopefully we're going to see a reintroduction of some kind of Palestinian Israeli talks, although my personal concern is Kamala Harris, whose husband is a very important AIPAC being the main Jewish lobbyist group who are very powerful. What her influence is going to be. She gave the keynote speech to AIPAC in 2017, something that is often covered up because we wanted Biden and Harris to win. We wanted to get rid of Trump, but her record on Israel isn't great. So we're waiting to see. Michael, I'm sure we'll be able to talk more on that. So I want to talk a bit about Yemen and then just about domestic America. Yemen is facing a colossal, catastrophic humanitarian. I teach a segment on Yemen to my Yale class this semester. As one expert Yemeni said to me, we're a backwater, therefore we've been pushed aside. I truly believe that Biden's going to look at it more because this famine that is looming could be disastrous. We could be going back to Somalia or Ethiopian proportions. We can't push it under the rug. It has to be examined. And meanwhile, with more on the table with Iran, perhaps, well, I don't want to say it will embolden the Houthis. It might, in fact, give more of a dialogue. Martin Griffiths, the UN envoy to Yemen, is a fantastic diplomat. Which brings me to diplomacy under Biden. We've seen, this week, if it had been normal times, Biden would have been at the Munich Security Forum, maybe with a stopover at NATO. I do think Biden is going to help restore those alliances, which Trump crushed. They're deeply important. And even though with NATO, for instance, France is quite snarky about the US, the Eastern countries are very in favor of a strong US presence. So I think Biden will help establish that, as well as just being, again, a multilateral player, a more important partner. And finally, I don't want to take up too much time because my colleagues have much to say. Could we talk briefly about domestic America? It's a mess. As someone who grew up with the National Health Service in England and the French socialized medicine system, which are both excellent, I'm shocked to see what happens in America if you don't have health insurance or if you're poor. And COVID, with its disastrous record of 500,000 people dead in America alone, which is half the number of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. If you're poor, if you're sick, you die here. You get extraordinary bills for surgery, for doctors. The vaccine now, every morning I get up at 7 a.m. and I fight against 4 million New Yorkers who are the most aggressive people in the world to try to get a vaccine appointment. I finally given up and I just say, like, when they come to me, I'll get it. But I'm not vulnerable. There are so many elderly, there's so many people of color in communities that can't access the internet. It's a completely broken system. COVID has also exacerbated the social justice in this country. We see who gets lawyers, who goes to prison, who gets healthcare, while the tech business is booming and Wall Street is booming. People in the Midwest are suffering terribly. Homelessness in San Francisco, which is the home, of course, of all these tech gazillionaires, is at the worst it's ever been. So I just think if we look at the US foreign policy, we have to see everything through the prism of what's actually happening in America right now. And to me, I see it as a broken country. The infrastructure is absolutely, I haven't even gotten to education, but the infrastructure is absolutely shattered. So Biden faces that, which is urgent. And then secondary, he faces climate change. We didn't talk about the withdrawal in Afghanistan. I leave that to Michael or one of my colleagues, Andrei. But thank you so much, everyone, for listening to me, and stay safe.
Janine, grazie mille. Thank you for your very frank observations. And speaking of education and the pandemic, one of the things the founder of Apple, Steve Jobs, left undone, unfortunately, that he really wanted to do was transform the educational sector. getting those physical textbooks out of the backpacks of young students that they struggle to bring to school and putting it all on a tablet. And just quickly before I go to Michael, you mentioned Iran. I wanted to remind everyone that this weekend, we're going to get yet another report on the Iranian downing of PS-752, that Ukrainian Airlines airliner, a tragedy which Iran has vociferously denied doing on purpose, and that, you know, a lot of relatives that we've spoken to are very much waiting for answers to that tragedy. Michael, why don't we pick up on where Janine left off? You're there in Atlanta, which was a very, of course, pivotal state, to say the least, in the recent Senate elections. But let's talk about the US, the degree of divisiveness. Is it cause for concern, especially if we take into account that the election wasn't exactly a mass repudiation of Trumpism, that some 70 million people still voted for him. So I guess what I'm asking is, should we fear, dare I say it, a Trump 2.0 in the next 4 years? And then let me ask you about the US foreign policy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Michael, and thanks, everyone. It's good to see some people I know and to be in such an august group. I mean, just picking up quickly on a couple of things that Janine said, and haven't seen Janine for a couple of years since the Colony Courtyard, which was a lovely meeting up with you. Healthcare, having lived in Australia and the UK, I could not agree more. It is a disaster here, and Americans keep saying they've got the best healthcare in the world. They do not, clearly. Social justice, yes. I mean, we're in a situation here where there is massive debate and rancor over lifting the federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to $10 an hour over 5 years. I mean, it is just outrageous when you look at it as a percentage of salary in this country. Infrastructure, we saw what happened in Texas. It's crumbling. It's rearward looking, not forward looking. Climate change will exacerbate that. Education, having just put one kid through college and another one still in college. You know, talk of forgiveness of $50,000 debt is a controversial thing here. The real controversy is why my daughter just got into law school at Boston College and they want her to pay $70,000 a year. That's the outrage. She's not going to go there, by the way. As for your initial question, Michael, I mean, I've been here 25 years now. I've never seen the country so divided. It is very clear Trumpism lives on in this country. And I think the decision for the GOP is whether to go all in with that, or, as you know, Liz Cheney and others would like to go back to a more traditional posture. You've got moderates leaving the party. That leaves Trump with a shrinking base. That core base is so loud, so passionate, and it gets so much coverage here. But the mathematical fact is it's not big enough to win an election. So turning off more traditional Republicans really isn't a smart move long term. You might be able to win a primary as a Trumper. You're not going to win a general in most cases. So you have the left and the right division, but you also have that Trump versus traditional in the GOP, and there's a real fracturing going on. It's important to say even on the left, you have division. You've got mainstream Democrat Biden versus an increasingly vocal progressive wing, a wing that can claim pretty solid public support for a lot of their positions, whether it be climate change or the minimum wage or, you know, other social or environmental issues. So it's a multifaceted division as I see it. And then you've got the social divisions as part of that. Things that were always there, racism to white supremacy to conspiracy theories, QAnon as one of those. Those things were always there, although QAnon obviously a more recent development, but they were always there, but they were given permission, if you like, by Trump to come out from under the rock. And a lot of that is now mainstream in many ways. The fringe has expanded into the mainstream. And when you look at that division, what does it mean for Biden on the legislative front? We've heard Republicans calling for healing and bipartisanship, but you look at everything that's gone on in recent weeks, from the COVID relief package to Senate confirmations, the GOP isn't being very bipartisan. And you can be assured of one thing, the now Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, he's not going to give Joe Biden any wins at all. His sole aim is to regain the Senate and his own power in 2022. That's my view, and that is his sole aim. Mike?
Michael, thank you. And as a quick follow-up, I mean, you sit in the anchor chair day in and day out surveying the globe. And I think during the Trump years, we saw a couple of things happen. One was the abdication of the US role as the traditional global policeman. And secondly, after especially what happened on Capitol Hill and the earlier divisiveness, I'm wondering, what is the image as you see it of the US abroad? I mean, are we going to see strongmen and autocrats saying to the US when they're criticized for canceling or postponing elections, well, look what's happening in your own backyard, why should we listen to you?
Well, I think so. Yeah, it's hard to roll back the emboldening, if you like, that we saw under Trump of autocrats. I mean, he put out pretty much a flashing green light to the strongmen and dictators, and it quickly became obvious that things like human rights, rule of law, democratic norms, and that were not issues Donald Trump was going to be pushing, and he didn't. I mean, we heard praise for Duterte, for Erdogan, MBS in Saudi called Egypt, Al-Sisi, my favorite dictator, pulled out of Syria's northeast, gave Turkey and Erdogan a free run. Will it continue? As I said, it's very hard to roll that back. You can expect a tougher line with Joe Biden, certainly with Erdogan in the context of NATO, perhaps with MBS. We're waiting to hear what comes out of that report, hopefully today or tomorrow. Time will tell whether they're emboldened going forward. In terms of the US position, and Janine touched on some of these things, and it's very interesting to me, in terms of US quote unquote leadership, a sigh of relief, no doubt, among allies. But, will US leadership be back 100% or not anytime soon? Because the world has seen the US turn on a dime politically. And I think you've seen with a lot of allies, they've kind of learned a lesson. The US isn't, I think, seen as the true and only leader of the free world anymore by many allies, and that might not come back anytime soon. I saw an analogy which I thought was good. It's like an abusive partner who comes back from rehab and says, I'm a changed man. I'm ready to earn back your trust. And that's going to take a while. And that speaks, further to the personality cult of Trump. I mean, the world has seen Trumpism. And as you said, Trump 2.0 could be back in 4 years, but perhaps a little less buffoonish and wearing more socially acceptable cloaks and less Twitter ranting. So I think there's probably a little bit of caution there among many allies in terms of US leadership, although relief, yes, obviously.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael, so much. I'd like now to turn, let's see how our technology works, to Michael Vaticiotis in Singapore. As I said, I had a chat with him earlier this week. We did a pre-record, and I started out by asking him about US policy towards Asia Pacific, but especially towards a more aggressive interventionist China, and what we can expect from the activity in the Taiwan Strait. Here we go.
Well, I think one has to pull back the focus a little bit and look at it in the broader context of US-China relations. What we're seeing with the Biden administration is, in the past, people have talked about Obama's pivot to Asia, Trump's effort to sort of ramp up competition with China. But the Biden administration has succeeded in doing something that no administration has done since the 1970s, which is to make a very, very effective swerve towards Asia, with the focus of not just foreign policy, economic policy, but also military strategy, to completely reorient that strategy away from the Middle East, what they used to call the sandbox, which of course has been the focus of the US military since the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so we're finally seeing the redeployment of assets to the Indo-Pacific, as they call it, to the Asia-Pacific region. We had 2 carrier groups steaming through the South China Sea in February alone. And I think this represents the most important shift in American foreign policy for the last 30 years. Now, what does it mean? It does mean, as Biden has said, and all his officials have said, that there will be a much harder policy towards China, both in terms of technological competition, in terms of holding China's feet to the fire on human rights, in terms of strategic competition. And many analysts that I know in this region are now seeing the South China Sea and possibly the East China Sea and the waters around Taiwan as the most proximate cause of war in the coming decade, simply because of the possibility that there could be a mishap or an accident that leads to a conflict between the US and China. So I think one has to look at this through the broader lens of a much more serious confrontation between the US and China under the Biden administration. How China responds to this is also a huge question. The Chinese are usually very careful when it comes to an incoming new administration. They're not showing their cards. And under President Xi Jinping, China's foreign policy has taken a sharp nationalist turn. Even projects that China was touting as little as 5 years ago with the Belt and Road and investment overseas, to some extent, China has pulled in its horns. These efforts have proved risky. They've been overextended in terms of financing. And I think Xi Jinping wants to really focus on defending China's strategic capacity. It's what they call the first island chain, the sort of defensive ring around China. And I think they want to focus on confrontation or the prevention of the US containment of China. And so I think that's where it's headed.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Our frontline friend Steve Sang in London, I think he's branded the foreign diplomacy under Xi Jinping as wolf warrior diplomacy. For example, here in Canada, you're seeing the Chinese ambassador, also in the UK, being much, much more aggressive than in the past, even writing op-eds into local newspapers and trying to influence public policy. It's quite an interesting approach compared to years past, Wayne.
Yeah, except on Taiwan, I think one thing that we still don't know, and I think this goes, the US, of course, has pinned a lot of its engagement in this region on a whole range of alliances and treaty allies, which of course involve commitments to defend those countries. And of course, there is a commitment to defend Taiwan if China invades. And so the big question is, if anything happens, what will the US do? Will it live up to those commitments, or will it shy away from a larger confrontation with another major superpower? We simply don't know.
All right, thank you, Michael. Let's go to Istanbul. Ayla, welcome again to the panel. Ayla, how can a country get more interesting? It's an aspiring regional superpower. It played a decisive role in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict by supporting Azerbaijan with combat drones. It's now actually looking to upgrade its drone technology with aerospace engines from Ukraine and elsewhere. And it's a NATO member, which buys arms from Russia and yet finds itself on opposite sides of Russia and Syria and Libya. And on the soft diplomacy front, it has for many years, I've seen it with my own eyes, developed huge humanitarian lift capacity to help countries during disasters. So given that kind of framing, how will Turkey try to navigate the Biden foreign policy, and how will the White House try to handle Turkey? Is it with nervous anticipation? Because I remember when you and I were talking earlier, you mentioned this proposed summit for democracy, and we wonder whether Turkey will be on the good guy or bad guy list on that one, whether they'll be invited, please.
Yeah. So we're still waiting to see how the relationship between Turkey and the US begins to evolve. Erdogan's request for a phone call with Biden back in December has still gone unanswered. When they do finally talk, there are a number of issues and disputes for them to discuss. And I think at the top of the list will be Turkey's acquisition of an advanced anti-aircraft system from Russia, one that is designed specifically to bring down the NATO's F-35 jet. The US has sanctioned Turkey over that purchase. Trump's administration's departing gift for Turkey because he chose a light set of sanctions. And Biden's top diplomat, Anthony Blinken, has said that it's possible that the United States will again review that. And another really significant issue, and one I think that exemplifies how Turkey is such a major player throughout the region, is the court case in the Southern District of New York against a Turkish state bank for its alleged role in helping Iran dodge sanctions back in 2012 and 2013. And it runs the risk of, if it's found guilty, of receiving a fine that could debilitate the financial system. So there are these incredibly important issues. There's a lot at stake here. And I think that there's also sort of a broader, maybe almost, existential issue for Turkey with the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Middle East. Not just Turkey, but other regional countries sought to fill that vacuum. And that has helped fuel a bitter competition between Turkey and Arab heavyweights like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, as well as with Israel. And Turkey, in the last year alone, staged, an incursion into Syria. It upended the conflict in Libya. It has staged aerial operations in Iraq. And as you said, it helped support its close ally, Azerbaijan, retake most of the territory it lost back in the initial conflict with Armenia 30 years ago. So with this much power projection and this much influence throughout the region, it's hard to imagine that Turkey would, want to give up its hard-earned clout that it now enjoys throughout the region. So it's going to be a challenge for Biden to both sort of turn, to backpedal a bit on on what Trump sort of had ceded, the ground that Trump had ceded to Turkey, encouraging at times that power projection, while keeping Turkey an engaged and constructive member of NATO. Turkey is essential. It has the second biggest military in NATO, and yet somehow discouraging it from doing things like buying Russian weapons. And the fear there, and it's been described as an existential threat for the US, because the fear there is, if you've got a NATO member that's buying weapons that can take down your prize project of the F-35, this huge, colossal, hundreds of billions of dollars project, who else is going to buy Russian equipment over NATO? So these are all the issues that Biden is going to have to tackle. I know he's got a very full plate when it comes to the rest of the world, but Turkey is intent on being a priority for him as well.
Fantastic as always, Ayla. Thank you. And I think one other world leader waiting for a phone call, or at least an invitation to the White House, is across the Black Sea from your President Zelensky, who never got that visit during the Trump years. Staying in the region, let's go to Lina. Lina, so 10 years after the Arab Spring, I wanted to ask you whether that Arab Spring has actually turned into a bitter winter. It's hard to believe it's already been 10 years. And some might say where there was fearless and victorious revolt, where there was jubilant hope, today there is failure and fear. And we're looking, for example, at Tunisia, which has a functional and durable democracy, Libya and Yemen, both mired in civil war, and Egypt, where the Arab winter is perhaps the most bitter, as our friend from PBS The NewsHour said recently. The number of political prisoners there is now at least 60,000, far more than either under Mubarak. And in 2019, the Egyptian constitution was amended to allow Al-Rais, President Sisi, to stay in power until 2030. So I wanted to ask you, what's your take 10 years later on the Arab Spring? Are things as bad or kind of depressing as they're portrayed to be in many media reports at the moment? Thank you.
Unfortunately, the winter is long, but let's hope that every winter will have a spring after. But for the moment, the coming spring seems to going to take so long for it to arrive in the Arab world again. 10 years ago, there was like incredible moments of hope, incredible moments of young people taking to the streets in different countries in Syria, breaking the mighty fist of Assad, braving to shout out loud and call for their need and call for their change. Today, 10 years later, there is neither bread nor freedom. That's a book written about Syria, but also can apply on many countries in the region. Egypt, the political situation run by Sisi is just cracking down on any activity, even on cultural activities inside Egypt. And the crackdown is targeting many activists, many human rights activists, and despite pressure from the international community, many are still tucked inside prison. There is in Syria, you've mentioned 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt. Well, in Syria, the prisoners, the ones who have been detained since the uprising began, the ones who are registered and known that their families are calling for them, is 150,000 prisoners. And we don't know if they are alive or dead. There are no trials. Nobody knows their whereabouts. They are, disappeared in security branches. This is on a political level. There are civil wars, as you mentioned, in the region. Poverty is staggering in many countries. In Yemen, in Egypt, Syria, 90% of the population is under the poverty line. Today, if you talk to some Syrians, they talk about starvation war. They say that when the bombs were falling, they were better. It was better because now, the middle class almost vanished. The currency devaluated by 250%. Imagine the situation. Yemen is like divided and also is on the brink of starvation. Libya is the same. Probably the only example that we can look at with some hope is Tunisia. But at the same time, one should also remember and acknowledge the incredible power of people, the incredible efforts of people who are still brave, still daring to talk, still daring to do something, even on a minimum level, but staying put where they are, trying to make change. And let's also bring Iraq to the equation. What happened, in 2019, the protests that took to the streets that were not of interest of the international world, but that was really unprecedented in a community that is controlled by the Shia, religious leaders, to have women out in the streets, even accusing the Shia leaders directly to them with their, controlling their country. Here in Lebanon, also in 2019, October, people took to the streets calling for change. Well, again, change didn't happen, but the power is there, the will is there. It's going to take a long time for another spring to come after winter.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Lina. I'm sure we'll be coming back to you. Before we go to our first question, and then I'd like to pivot a little bit to COVID-19. Andrei, welcome to the panel. Andrei, so as I mentioned, we have the Duma elections that are supposed to happen before September, but I'm wondering, with the opposition so fractured and with Putin's most significant opponent, Alexei Navalny, behind bars, and with the massive security structure poised to put down protests, I think in a previous panel, I heard you, or one of your colleagues say, between the National Guard and the FSB, we're talking about 400, 500,000 members of that security force. It's massive. But where does all that leave the opposition? The crackdown on the protest, the jailing of Navalny, and at the end of the day, might public disenchantment with things like corruption and lower living standards and pensions, smart voting as well, may that make a difference in that election? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for having me. Well, right now the mood is depressing in Moscow because we got some protests on Moscow streets and some other cities, but the problem is that the numbers are not that high. It's completely incomparable with what we saw 10 years ago in 2011, 2012, and we got our version of Arab Spring, and it was also a disaster. But the problem is that with the most recent wave of protests, it's even more tiny, and people got really scared about what could happen to them. They looked at Belarus and Minsk, and they see that it looks like there is some exchange of practices and experiences between Lukashenko and Putin, and they use the same methods, and there is this releasing feeling that because Putin is already under sanctions, he can actually do more to suppress dissent than he could, say, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. The other problem is that I've been covering the Russian secret services for 20 years, and I see that with the new generation of security services right now, we see that this new generation, they understand to some extent that their operations, either online or offline operations, hacking operations, or poisoning operations, or assassinations abroad, they get exposed quite routinely right now in the West. And they sort of adjusted to that. They found a way how to use these operations to intimidate the population in the country. And we also see that they use even the failed attempts of poisoning, like in 2018 in the UK, the poisoning of the Skripals. Still, they use this example to send a message to political emigres in the outside of the country, but it's better to be more cautious. The other problem is that with the hacking operations, it looks like the Kremlin found a way to send a very strong message, specifically to the US and Europe, that your tactics of, say, naming and shaming, which the United States has been using since 2016 against Russia and since 2015 against China, doesn't work anymore. So yes, you name and shame our people, but we keep going, we keep attacking you. And it's already became quite successful. We see, for instance, France trying to get into some sort of bilateral negotiations with Russia on cyber, and of course, it's a very good sign for the Kremlin that they can do that, even if with the operations routinely exposed. The other problem which we sometimes overlook is that the Kremlin found a way to use the sanctions to actually to boost support for the Kremlin among the most active part of the population, the middle classes and the big Russian companies. And why is that? Because they found a way how to channel money of government money to big companies and tech companies, including via military contracts. The military industrial complex right now in Russia is really huge. It's something comparable with the Soviet Union, to be honest. And we see that the army, as a consequence, getting more and more ambitious. Now the army has a say in ideology questions. They have a say about how to teach children in schools, and they have the youth army in Russian schools, and it's a clear brainwashing operation. The army just built up the biggest church. It's all painted green. It's absolutely crazy thing, but they built this church to send a message where we are the army now, have a say in all important questions in the Russian society. They also have a say about how to think about Russian history, which was always been a very ideological thing for the country. And as a consequence, the Russian military operations are getting more ambitious. And it's I think it's a very dangerous game that we got so many people in uniform happy to take some risk and to do some things while abroad.
Okay, Andrei, and thank you for that. Just quickly, because I know some time is flying by, but there have been some questions sent directly to me. As briefly as you can, foreign adventurism by Putin has been a favorite way of his to either gain political points at home or distract attention from problems. I'm looking at Eastern Ukraine, for example. Might we see more expansion or adventurism there? Will Russia continue its activity in Syria and elsewhere?
I think it's entirely possible. As I said, the military is getting more and more ambitious. And I think it's entirely possible to see something happening in Ukraine. And also, to be honest, there are some options always open for the Kremlin, like Belarus. You can do something like reuniting all Slavic nations in one country and to build a real Russian-Belarusian alliance, getting rid of Lukashenko if you find this appropriate. So these options are always there.
Great. Okay, so before we get to the next question, and I want to pivot in the time we have left to COVID-19, let's go back to across the Pacific to Michael Vaticiotis. And I asked him, actually, I think the question is in the video about the effect of the pandemic on diplomacy in that part of the world. Go ahead. And the topic, I want to try and wind up slowly here, but the topic of obviously the coronavirus will figure quite big in the panel. And the way China handled the first few weeks of COVID-19, it seemed to be the old playbook of denial, denial, denial. And anyone who spoke up was rounded up or arrested or silenced, including some doctors that figured quite prominently in the media. I'm wondering how you see their handling now. Is there perhaps more of a transparency? Because I don't think we've seen, as you and I were discussing earlier, the end of the virus. It could even make a comeback in China. In fact, there have been some hotspots. But do you think perhaps a lesson has been learned and they'll be more forthright and transparent when it comes to, and also more international cooperation with sharing information?
Well, you know, there is a precedent because, of course, China was also involved in the 2002-2003 SARS outbreak. And I think it's the nature of the system in China that information is instinctively withheld. There is a desire for complete control over messaging in the communist system, which means that it's unlikely to change. I do think that China is more serious about contributing to, if you like, the global commons in terms of public health. We've seen them, you know, develop a vaccine that they want to use and share widely with the developing world. So I think it's this combination of, on the one hand, China wants to be more open and cooperative and show that it can contribute to the global commons. On the other hand, the very system that governs China makes it very, very difficult to be open and transparent. And so they're sort of caught on the horns of this dilemma, which is not usually well resolved. We've seen the WHO team who came to China finally to investigate the origins of COVID-19 be widely criticized after they finished their investigation for not really sort of pushing the Chinese hard enough. Yeah. I think it remains to be seen, you know, what their final report will say. But I think it's fair to say that there will always be this instinct in China to control the messaging, which of course makes it very, very difficult because the speed with which these viruses now spread around the world makes it very important for people to be transparent. But I will say finally that, you know, it's also fair to say that the rest of the world hasn't necessarily been bathed in glory in this respect. Right. The sort of state of denial in the United States and in many other countries, the quarreling over which vaccine is more effective than the other, which is clearly politically or geopolitically driven, I think makes it, I think, fair to say that even in a global pandemic like this, the global system, I think, and that's the real problem, there isn't a good and strong international system that can be led in an impartial way to look after the global commons as they used to be perhaps shortly after the Second World War. That's gone. And the leadership of that system needs reshaping.
Couldn't agree with you more. Kind of lastly, Michael, you're one of the foremost experts in conflict and conflict resolution. And in the panel, we'll be looking at how journalism has been impacted by COVID-19. But I wanted to put it to you, if I may, how perhaps conflict resolution has been impacted by the pandemic. And what I mean by that, I was speaking a few weeks ago to one of the world's top humanitarian diplomats, Peter Maurer of the ICRC. He and the Secretary General of the UN both said that it's much more difficult now to resolve conflict, for example, with non-state parties, because you can't physically meet with them. It's very difficult. And that there have been so many times in the past where it's that physical contact, that looking eye in the eye, that has made such a big difference in resolving things. How do you see that? Do you think we may see some conflicts lasting longer or perhaps even worsening because things are kind of restrained in that way right now?
Well, it's certainly a very mixed picture. I mean, I would very much agree with you. And I think across the board, face-to-face diplomacy has more or less ground to a shuddering halt. And especially in Asia, where borders are more effectively closed, we've seen a complete halt in the sort of candid face-to-face interaction that was able to manage and govern some of these conflicts in the past. I mean, not just subnational conflicts, but also interstate conflicts. And as a result, the tensions have risen, suspicions have grown, mistrust has deepened. And I think it's fair to say that until there's a restoration of that face-to-face interaction, we're going to see that process of deepening mistrust and growing suspicion just get worse and worse. I think, having said that, people are growing used to the virtual platforms, and I think it works better at a sort of lower, when it comes to heads of government and officials, it's very difficult to actually have fruitful discussions online. But parties to conflict and those who are working on the ground to build trust, I mean, it is possible. It's difficult. It's not the same. You can more or less just go over old ground, not break new ground. You can more or less deal with people you know, not people you don't know. It's very difficult to forge new relationships. But it is possible just to keep the thing ticking over until we can return to a more normal situation. I think people are beginning to sort of get through these impenetrable sort of COVID walls, but it's still very slow. And what worries me more than anything else is that just the whole sort of overall architecture of diplomacy has really started to show weakness, cracks. And I think there's a greater danger of a sort of a multilateral crisis. How on earth do you get climate change talks going in a situation like this? How on earth do you manage the free and open access to COVID-19 vaccine in a situation like this? It's very, very hard. We're finding here in this region that countries are simply not talking to each other. They're not picking up the phone to one another. Wow. They don't think about it because, of course, they're all concerned about their own internal situation. And I think this has really brought about a breakdown in normal functioning diplomacy, which is very dangerous.
Thank you very much, Michael. Just a housekeeping note here. We're going to beg your indulgence and go for about another half hour. Usually we end a bit shorter because I think given the gravity of the topics and all the wealth of knowledge we have here, it warrants that. So I hope, especially Lina and Ayla, you're on the later time zones. You can stay with us. I'm going to toss over one of the questions that's come across from John Owen. I believe he's in Vancouver. And Janine, perhaps you can take this one. He cites the role of the media, especially the right-wing media, but also the middle of the road and left-wing media in kind of inciting the violence and divisiveness of really ramping people up during the Trump years. How do you respond to that?
So first I have to preface it by saying there was someone earlier on the chat who said that I hadn't recognized that 70 million Americans voted for Trump. And I do think we have to bring that up. 70 million people did and do support Donald Trump and do believe in his policies. I may not very clearly, but many people do. So the divisions in America are being fought out in the media. And John Owen, hi John, knows this better than anyone. I mean, during the election, it got to the point where for me, and sorry about this, Michael Holmes, but it was impossible for me to watch CNN, MSNBC, whose side I'm on, and then turn back to Fox or the talk radio. John mentions Rush Limbaugh, who passed away last week. He was a kind of god hero of the shock jock radio DJs, but much loved. And I think the real divisions in America that have been stoked so painfully by politics were played out in the media. And it's been a shame because even my beloved New York Times, for me, was difficult to read because it's hard to find a common ground, which is why, sometimes we turn to the FT, the Washington Post, which were slightly more neutral, but it's very hard to find neutral. And just very quickly, I'll stop because I know we're on time, but if any of you saw the Super Bowl, Bruce Springsteen did a very powerful video called The Middle, and it was since taken, America being puritanical America, Bruce Springsteen had been arrested for drinking 2 shots of tequila, and so Jeep, who sponsored the ad, took it off their website. But it was a very poignant rendition about how America has been so widely skewered to the left, to the right, and we desperately need it to find a kind of healing that President Biden talks about. We need to somehow find a middle ground. The media has not allowed us to do that. And being a part of the media, I'm guilty of it because clearly I have very strong views about Trump.
Thank you. Michael Holmes, anything to add on that, on the media and how it's handled this? And just on a kind of side footnote, I started part of my career writing for MSNBC, and I noticed the Republicans are now calling it MSDNC. Anyway, but if you can maybe follow up on that question and answer.
Yeah, I think that what happened with Trump is that a lot of media, and there was always, of course, opinion media, particularly when you talk about the Foxes, Newsmax, OANN, and so on. Always been a lot of that, but certainly I noticed that there was almost more of a responsibility under Trump of, I'm reminded of the old saying I was told when I was a young journalist. They said, that your job, if somebody says, is it raining? It's not to say, well, somebody says it is and somebody says it isn't. Your job's to stick your head out the window and see if it's bloody raining. And I think that under Trump, there was a lot less both sidesism required. It was an extraordinary situation of fact-checking a US president in real time. And ultimately, instead of saying, well, he says this and they say that, saying, well, no, that was a lie. And that became a responsibility. And I think it did change a lot of how the media behaved under Trump. I think also the media made a pretty grievous error in not understanding the anger of a certain section of the population, the alienation felt by that certain section of the population that led to the rise of Trump and Trumpism and the support for it that exists even now. This sizable part of America that felt unheard and felt that he heard them rightly or wrongly, because, the fact is Trump wouldn't sit down and have a beer with most of that segment of the American population who feel unheard. But he was seen by them as giving them hope or giving them some sort of voice. Whether that is true or not, you can debate ad infinitum. But it certainly did change how reporting was done, I think, in terms of not having the both sidesism that I think traditionally media does.
Thank you, Michael. And speaking how reporting is done, Ayla, over in Istanbul, when you and I talked earlier, we were talking about how the craft of journalism has been impacted by COVID-19. A lot of journalists are kind of stuck in place because of safety concerns, not able to travel. We've all probably commented or written a lot about how the world's strongmen and autocrats are leveraging the pandemic to level the playing field in their favor by putting in restrictions on everything from court hearings to elections. What's your take on this, and especially where you're based right now in Turkey?
Yeah, on the first point about how journalism is impacted, that sort of lack of face-to-face time, as the other Michael said, has been extremely frustrating and has impacted the way that we tell stories. For print reporters, in some ways, just as much as it is for broadcasters, and I hope that sooner than later we'll be able to return to doing things the way that we have, sitting down with people, talking to them, making human connections. That's been one of the most difficult things. And then in terms of the response of some of these more authoritarian leaders, it's a mixed record for governments of all stripes. In Turkey, which I can talk about most in detail, there's been some frustrating decisions made. For instance, last year, early on, there was an amnesty that released thousands and thousands of prisoners, but not political prisoners, not journalists, not party activists who were in prison, not the dissidents. So it's been used as a cudgel in some ways against those groups. In Turkey, have had sort of, how should I say, partial lockdowns, really. We locked down on weekends. We locked down at 9 p.m. And during those lockdowns, well, first of all, the reason why it's been sort of partial lockdowns throughout the last year and not full on is because the economy still needs to keep going. This isn't a country that it's a country that says it can't afford to, pay for people not to work and not to commute. That has made it obviously difficult to fully contain it, and we don't actually have a sense of how large the scale of the crisis is here. The government dutifully releases figures every day on the number of new cases, the number of deaths, and so on. But last year, back in, I think it was September, they acknowledged that for months they had stopped reporting asymptomatic cases, and that those asymptomatic cases accounted for something roughly, 2/3 of the full number. I mean, it was just, the numbers were, it was clear that the numbers were skewed, and that just destroyed trust in that kind of reporting. So it's really difficult now for Turks' true sense of how severe the crisis is. Should they go to that wedding? Should they stay at home? Should they go and visit their elderly relative? Because that instinct by authoritarian leaders to not share information, that lack of an obligation to be clear and transparent about something as basic as public health, really has compounded the problem here. And so I think that must be something that other countries are also experiencing.
Okay, thank you for that, Ayla. I'd like to go to Lina and then to Andrei. We cannot have this panel and not talk about COVAX and vaccine inequity. As we speak at the moment, 1.3 billion doses of the COVID-19 vaccine has gone to more than 90 low and middle income countries this year. We're supposed to be going through the COVAX facility from WHO, but Ghana became the first country yesterday. But residents in just 10 countries have received 80% of the world's shots. And here where I sit in Canada, we're the largest ordering country. We ordered enough to vaccinate the population 5 times over. So whereas the African Union has ordered only enough to vaccinate 38% of the population. Lina, what is the situation in your region when it comes to the provision of COVID vaccines? And are we seeing some kind of vaccine diplomacy where, for example, China and Russia, through their benevolence, their humanitarian hearts, are donating vaccines, and sometimes I believe they're asking for something in return as well?
Well, it depends on which country you're talking about. You have the Gulf that are rich, who are, careful about this. They've already started the vaccine process. They've already, almost gave vaccine to all their, population. You have Israel also. They've done the job of like vaccinating most of the population, but the rest of the country, it's all the politics, and also the politics of the government and how they dealt with the corona situation itself. Egypt, they have used the Chinese vaccine, but they haven't provided it for, the numbers are very, very low in comparison to 90 million, people in Egypt. Here in Lebanon, of course, it's a very small country with 4 million people and plus 1.5 million refugees, but still the portion of the vaccines that they've got is almost like 25,000 vaccines so far. So with this ratio of providing vaccine will probably take 10 years to vaccine all the population in this region. Syria, for example, is just, there is a huge debate whether it's the Russian or the Chinese vaccine. Of course, they were not going to get the American vaccine. But the question is, mainly in these countries, what are the responsibilities that they are taking towards the lockdown, the restrictions, the treatment for people, the raising awareness for people on the COVID-19. I was in Syria in November, and I was almost the only one wearing mask. In the streets, they would look at me. If I'm wearing mask, then I am the one with corona. corona. People are queuing for bread, for gas, for fuel, for 8 to 10 hours, one after the other. No one is wearing masks, and no one can afford buying the mask. So let alone to come to the vaccine stage. I think like in many countries, it's only the powerful, the rich, the ones who are able to do it will get it. In Lebanon, it's also political. There is a big row now that, 16 MPs got the vaccine even before, without going through the process of registering and age and priority and frontline. And there was a big anger here. But at the same time, they are providing for frontline workers and, elderlies and those with chronic diseases. It's a big question in this whole region where there is no transparency, no one is able to hold their government accountable. They don't trust the system. So it's hard to see when everyone or every vulnerable one will be able to get the vaccine.
Yeah, very interesting. And I was talking to journalist Shahira Amin in Cairo recently, and she said there the government has taken the decision to prioritize the economy over public health because the Egyptian economy is made up of so many small family-owned businesses. Shutting down the economy, putting people in lockdown, people would starve. So, Andrei, we see the V campaign, Sputnik V vaccine being sent around the world. I think the most recent images I saw, we get them mixed up. It's either China or Russia sending vaccines to Egypt. But anyway, what is the Kremlin thinking when it comes to this campaign of sharing Russian vaccine? Are they doing it out of a pure humanitarian streak, or do they expect something in return, positive PR? What's going on?
Oh, first of all, we need to understand that the whole crisis, COVID crisis, proved to be a big and absolutely surprising success for the Kremlin and for Putin personally. It started with the outbreak of COVID in April last year, when the Moscow middle classes and liberal intelligentsia, people who traditionally are the most critical of the Kremlin, they asked and demanded the government to be more totalitarian at introducing restrictions fighting COVID. For instance, they were absolutely fine with all kinds of surveillance technologies used by Moscow government. And to be honest, we go so far on this direction, which might be only Chinese event that far. We got special applications on our phones. We have sharing of databases, cars, and CCTV cameras and face recognition system, catching people on the streets, issuing all kinds of fines for people who actually were absolutely innocent. And the problem was that liberal classes and middle classes were absolutely fine with that. The next, what happened is that Putin introduced the amendments to the constitution, and actually making himself a czar, basically. And the problem was that the Russian opposition said that they had no response to that because they asked for more and more restrictions. So they found themselves in a big trap. They cannot ask people to go to the streets to protest because they asked before for more restrictions. And the government used that very, very skillfully. And next comes Sputnik. And against initial concerns about the efficiency of this vaccine, now most of my liberal friends in Moscow and other cities, they took this jab, and it goes to foreign correspondents based in Moscow, to some employees of American embassy in Moscow. And of course, the Kremlin tries to use it in all kinds of ways. And to be honest, it is quite successful. The message is there that if Putin wants something to be done, he can do that. And lots of people got it.
Okay, thank you. Just a reminder, we have about 15 minutes left, and we'd love to take more audience questions. A good way is to press on the raise your hand icon at the bottom of the screen, and you can actually ask your question live, and also the Q&A function, just type it in there. Michael Holmes over there in Atlanta, you're very familiar with Afghanistan. It's also a country where, of course, Russia has a long history, but now we're seeing the day when precipitous withdrawal of US troops in Afghanistan. There was also really chilling reporting done on PBS NewsHour by a freelance correspondent in Kabul, documenting how intellectuals, how journalists, how civil society leaders are being basically assassinated in broad daylight, the future of Afghanistan being erased in front of our eyes, and of course, the growing footprint of the Taliban. Where does that leave us right now?
Well, in a very precarious position. I mean, I remember clearly that my first time in Afghanistan was literally days after the Taliban had been forced out of Kabul, and witnessing over the course of the next couple of months the city come back from that. And I remember doing stories on the film industry and interviewing people who'd hidden reels of film and old movie posters in fake walls in buildings and stuff like that to try to preserve some of the history, because of course the Taliban destroyed whatever film they got their hands on. People being able to play music, and of course, you know, girls being able to eventually go to school at some level, at least, certainly an improvement on the Taliban years. And you know, the other thing in multiple trips there over the years is seeing that, with a few exceptions of a few units, Afghan forces have not been able to stand up while US forces stand down. Their death rates, their casualty rates are through the roof. And so you get a lot of issues also with desertion and so on. A precipitous withdrawal risks, of course, the vacuum factor. You know, I think, you know, most Americans would love to leave Afghanistan after 20 years, but the reality is that, as many, you know, experts will say, there will be a vacuum. It would almost certainly result in some level of civil war that would likely lead to the Taliban being in charge again within a year, 2, 3, whatever. And then the lawlessness that goes along with that. It's a very hard country to govern centrally. Central government, you know, they used to say that, you know, Karzai governs his backyard, and that's about it. There are many, many factors that make Afghanistan a very risky place to pull out of. And certainly you hear it from US security experts. They worry that, you know, there will be another, you know, Osama bin Laden base there or whatever, and it presents a risk. And I guess, you know, you look at in a global sense, and we're talking about allies, but US troops are still in Germany, they're still in Japan, they're still in South Korea, allies certainly. But, you know, I don't know, it's not a preferred option for anyone, I think, but it's not beyond the pale that, given those national security risks that the US perceives of a lawless and perhaps Taliban-run Afghanistan, that US presence stays there for a while. And you know, that's sad for Afghanistan, but the reality on the ground is that, you know, if the US were to pull out en masse, as Donald Trump was wanting to do, I think it would be catastrophic for the Afghan people as much as anything.
Michael, from everything you've heard from the new Biden administration, his new Secretary of State, and others who are going through the nomination process, do you agree with what Michael Vaticiotis said, that the administration is doing not a pivot, but a big swerve towards Asia Pacific and leaving what he called the Middle East sandbox? Is there any indication of that?
Well, he's more of an expert on that than I. I mean, Obama wanted to take that route, and of course Trump disengaged. And I think that you will see Biden take more of an interest in the Asia Pacific region for sure, because he's got to make up a lot of lost ground. That vacuum was filled in many ways by China. And the thing about, you know, China, they play the long game, and, you know, to sort of use the old Afghan saying, you know, you in the West have the watches, we have the time. And I think China, in the bigger picture, adopts that posture. They're looking decades down the road in terms of influence and economics. And I think the West sometimes falls into the trap of a more immediate worldview. China has gained a lot of economic and political influence with the Belt and Road Initiative, not just in the Asia Pacific region, but in Africa, of course, and has a pretty big head start in those areas, helped along by Trump's withdrawal from areas where the US traditionally had advantages and influence politically and economically. The one sort of saving grace in all of that, having said that, is, you know, China's economy is intertwined with the US. The US imports so much from China. China relies on those exports to the US. There are mutual considerations, I think, that sort of underpin those efforts by Biden to try to mitigate the imbalance on all sorts of issues, from trade to intellectual property, unfair practices, and so on.
Great, thank you. And we didn't have time to get to Myanmar on this panel, but it was very interesting that right before the coup by the junta, the senior ministers from China and Russia both visited Myanmar and were given the red carpet treatment. And one wonders whether there was any influence there. I'd like to go back to Lina and Andrei. We've had a question come in from Gary McDonald. Don't know where he is, but thank you, Gary, that it's becoming increasingly dangerous for journalists around the world, including, of course, in North America, where they're being targeted. People are being incited to, use violence against them. I'm wondering where you are, Lina. How do you see the situation being there as a journalist traveling through the region? Either the danger from that, or also from, again, as we talked earlier, authorities using the excuse of COVID-19 to put more restrictions on.
Well, this is not a region where there is freedom of expression or freedom of thoughts. And so journalists are the first ones to be targeted, writers, whoever are expressing their minds. Egypt, the number of, it comes at the end with the number of journalists being detained. The same in Syria, they're targeted, they're killed. But that's, here in Lebanon, it's divided. There is a good freedom of expression here, but it's all politicized, people are divided, but there are also some targeting of intellectuals. Only 40 days ago, one of the most important intellects in Lebanon has been assassinated. So COVID is not an excuse. It's an already gloomy situation for journalists and for those who are working in expressing the mind. I have to say COVID was not a restriction or added to the situation, because many of the countries did not follow strict rules on lockdown. Here in Lebanon, they were pretty good with the trying to protect the population and protect the health system with the lockdown, but journalists were exempted because we would be able to move freely. And as I said, Lebanon is an exception because there is some level of freedom of expression to journalists, despite the assassination. But if you look at the rest of the region, it's really bad. I mean, still there are incredible initiatives, incredible people who are still trying to do something. Again, I would mention Egypt, the great journalist Lina Atallah, the project Mada Masr. There are many clusters of small independent projects in the region, Daraj Media, Rasif 22, and many others, like even in Iraq. But at the end, the main stream media, the media that is controlled by the regime, it's so polarized, it's so poisonous with trying to control people's mind. And many of the local journalists who are not working for international organizations, they are very threatened by what they say, what they do, and they follow restrictions. In Syria and in Egypt at the beginning, they were prevented from reporting on any cases on corona. Corona did not exist. They didn't want to acknowledge that there is corona case. Today, as we are talking, there are so many news about 150 people, not journalists, just people expressing their anger on Facebook about the economic situation inside Syria. They disappeared in prison, and they are regime journalists. We're not talking here about opposition versus government or those who are criticizing Assad or the regime. People are complaining about poverty, about the power cut, about fuel shortages. They disappear. So the situation with or without COVID is already very bad when it comes to freedom of expression, when it comes to journalists and to free media and free press in this part of the world.
Thank you, Lina. Andrei, I'm almost afraid to ask you, but journalists, especially, of course, those outside of mainstream media in Russia, very much on the target list of the Kremlin these days?
The situation with journalists never really rose in Russia. And I remember I worked in Novaya Gazeta when Anna Politkovskaya was killed in 2006. But I would say that very recently we've seen some fundamental changes, shifts For instance, now the Russian government adopted new legislation which makes it possible to portray journalists as foreign agents. I mean, not only the organizations we work for as foreign agents that we adopted years ago, but now physical persons could be described as foreign agents, and it's horrible. They also could be accused of state treason, and we already got some cases. And last summer, when a journalist was sent to jail as a traitor, as a spy, with no evidence provided by the government. Also, during this last wave of protests, we see that, and actually I've never seen so many journalists being beaten by police before. That never happened before, and it looks like there is an exchange of experiences between Minsk and Moscow at this regard. But also there is some hope. For instance, we got an upsurge in digital investigations, and we got several teams of investigative journalists. And I think the New York Times actually ran a really good piece on Russian investigative teams, investigative journalism teams just last week, naming 6 or 7 teams, and it's huge. I mean, these teams are not really big, but they produce first quality journalism, exposing things from Putin's palace to his illegal assets and his friends and war crimes, all kinds of things. So, well, still there is some hope, and people and my colleagues, they're trying to do something, and sometimes they do a brilliant job.
Thank you, Andrei, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of us when we salute their work, their bravery. Before we wrap up, let's give this a go. We have a question from Andrew Kane. He's raised his hand. Andrew, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to listen to all the discussion, and Michael, you may remember me. But there's one or two things I think, as an elderly person, I can maybe contribute, and that is the perception, and the perception of things as they are. Every human is motivated by self-interest, but our self-interest differs across the world. And I would just take it in not a logical order, but what we're talking about in Turkey and Turkey's response to the West. Now, that may be because Turkey has been a stalwart of NATO from the start and has had a desire to enter the European Union, but has been sidelined for generations, while it sees those countries that were enemies accede to the European Union. So to some extent, you can understand Turkey's view. With regards to China, we have a perspective on China from much of the Western media that China is the enemy, China is a threat. But in reality, since 1978, Deng Xiaoping set out an ambition to develop a moderately well-off society by 2021. The 100th anniversary of the forming of the Communist Party of China. Now, you could argue that he's been successful, or they have been successful. Not democratic as we understand it, but successful.
Sorry, Andrew, can you get to your question? Why don't we, take the Turkey one first, and we'll go to Ayla for that. Sorry to interrupt you, but we're pushing really up against our time. Ayla, please go ahead. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay.
Yeah, Andrew has a good point. A lot of the dramatic shift in Turkish foreign policy, at least directly from the president's mouth, has to do with the fact that the West took Turkey for granted for too long, and that its newly militarized and far more aggressive stance is earning the West respect, or at least its deference. So that frustration is something that Erdogan articulates quite regularly, that Turkey was effectively pushed into this corner. And there certainly is some truth to that. But at the same time, Turkey does remain a member of NATO, and officially it does still want to join the European Union, Erdogan says, despite the fact that negotiations to enter the bloc have been on ice effectively soon after Turkey became a candidate. So it's kind of, maybe this might be a bit of an oversimplification, but it's having your cake and eating it too. Are you, if you are a member of the military pact, can you still go ahead and buy, missiles that are aimed at bringing down your alliance's aircraft? So the frustration is right, and it's important to talk about that, the motivations behind this shift. But at the same time, I think it's also fair to question what it means for Turkey's commitment to these partnerships.
Okay, thank you, Ayla. I'm afraid we've bumped up to the maximum of our time allotment. I'd like to thank all of those who've posed questions. I'm sorry we didn't get time to go to all of them. I'd like to really thank our esteemed panelists, Michael Vatikiotis, Janine di Giovanni, Michael Holmes, Ayla Yackley, Andrei Soldatov, and Lina Sinjab. I'd like to also end on a kind of inspirational quote from the Op-Ed Project in New York, and this is really great for journalists to be reminded, and opinion people, is that, quote, "If you say things of consequence, there may be consequences. The alternative is to be inconsequential." Thank you to the Frontlines, Pranvera Smith and her wonderful team. Please check back regularly at frontlineclub.com for future events, and do consider supporting the club, either becoming a member, a local member, overseas member. When things normalize, perhaps dropping into the club to learn, to meet interesting people, to eat and dine, again, as soon as conditions allow. Again, our heartfelt thanks to all of you. Please stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you.